The weather in early June had turned foul, with a storm system moving in that brought high winds and rough seas that made the channel dangerous even for experienced sailors. The meteorological officers, studying their charts and weather patterns, had confidently predicted that invasion conditions would be impossible for at least several days, possibly more than a week. This forecast had a calming effect up and down the chain of command, allowing officers who had been on edge for weeks to finally relax a bit. Some went on leave, others caught up on sleep, and the general state of readiness dropped from high alert to routine watchfulness. Even Rommel himself, confident that the weather would prevent any cross-channel operation, had departed France to return to Germany for his wife's birthday, a brief personal break that he felt he could afford given the meteorological situation. The storm had passed through on the 5th of June, leaving the seas still choppy and the skies overcast, exactly the kind of conditions that conventional wisdom said would prevent a major amphibious operation. So when Richter climbed up to his observation post in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, he expected another routine watch, another morning of staring at empty water while his men went through their maintenance routines. The night had been relatively quiet, though there had been scattered reports of aircraft activity inland, but aircraft were always around and the reports seemed routine. The air was cold enough that his breath misted in front of his face, and the salt smell of the sea mixed with the earthy scent of the farmland behind the bluffs. The observation post was comfortable enough by military standards, with its thick concrete walls keeping out the worst of the wind, and Richter settled in with a cup of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt grain but at least provided some warmth. His powerful Zeiss binoculars, one of the few pieces of truly excellent equipment he had been issued, hung around his neck ready for use. He was looking toward the east, watching for the first hints of dawn to break the darkness, when something caught his attention. It was not a sound, but rather a sense that something had changed in the quality of the darkness out over the water. He raised the binoculars to his eyes and adjusted the focus, scanning the horizon methodically as he had done 1,000 times before. What he saw made his heart stumble in his chest. There was a shape out there, a dark mass that did not belong to the natural seascape. He adjusted the focus again, thinking perhaps it was a trick of the light or a low-lying fog bank, but the image only became clearer and more impossible. Ships, not one or two, but a cluster of them, and as he panned the binoculars left and right, he saw more and more, an endless succession of dark hulls and superstructures emerging from the gloom like ghosts materializing from another dimension. His professional training kicked in even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He began trying to count them, to categorize them by type, to make some rational sense of the scene before him. He could identify battleships by their distinctive profiles, their massive gun turrets visible even at this distance. Cruisers moved among them, and swarms of smaller destroyers darted around the larger vessels like protective dogs around a flock of sheep. But beyond these warships, stretching back toward the horizon in formation after formation, were landing craft of every conceivable size and type. They were packed so densely in some areas that they seemed to form a solid mass, a continuous bridge of steel connecting England to France. He swept the binoculars across the entire visible horizon, and everywhere he looked the story was the same. The English Channel, which had been empty grey water just minutes before, had transformed into a floating city, a metropolis of military vessels that defied every estimate and prediction that German intelligence had ever made. The scope of what he was witnessing began to overwhelm his ability to maintain professional detachment. He tried to count again, but gave up when he reached several hundred without making a dent in the visible fleet. His hands, normally steady even under fire, began to tremble slightly as the implications crashed down on him. This was not a raid, not a probe, not even a major attack. This was an existential event, a force so massive that it represented not just a military operation, but a manifestation of industrial and organizational power on a scale he had never imagined possible. The official estimates he had seen suggested the Allies might assemble perhaps 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that number had seemed almost fantastical. What was sitting out there in the channel made those estimates look absurdly conservative. In reality, though he could not know it at that moment, the Allied Armada totaled nearly 7,000 vessels from 8 different nations, the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled in human history. But statistics meant nothing when confronted with the actual sight of it, this impossible concentration of military power that seemed to fill the entire world from one end of vision to the other. He fumbled for the field telephone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline and cold. The line crackled to life, and he identified himself to the duty officer at the other end, trying to keep his voice level and professional, even though everything in him wanted to scream. He reported what he was seeing, describing the fleet in terms that he knew sounded hysterical, talking about thousands of ships stretching from horizon to horizon, an invasion force of unimaginable size forming up for an assault. The voice on the other end sounded tired and skeptical, the tone of someone dealing with what they assumed was an overexcited junior officer seeing shadows in the dark. They mentioned that there had been some reports of ships, possibly a raid or a small operation, and told him to stand by for further instructions. Richter felt frustration boiling up inside him as he realized they did not believe him, could not believe him, because what he was describing was too far outside their frame of reference to be accepted without visual confirmation. He shouted into the phone that they were wrong, that the weather reports were wrong, that every assumption they had made was wrong because he was looking at the evidence with his own eyes. He slammed the phone down and immediately grabbed another line, this time connecting directly to his regimental commander. The major who answered sounded more alert but equally skeptical, asking Richter if he was absolutely certain of what he was reporting, given that the weather conditions were supposed to make an invasion impossible. Richter's response was almost savage in its intensity, telling the major that the weather was clear enough to see the end of the world arriving on schedule, and that he was requesting permission to engage the fleet that was sitting in their sector like a steel wall. The urgency in his voice finally seemed to cut through, and he could hear the major beginning to take the report seriously, though the paralysis in the command structure would continue for precious hours as officers tried to reconcile what they were being told with what their training and intelligence briefings had led them to expect. While Richter was on the phone arguing with headquarters, his men had begun to notice the commotion and were climbing up to observation points to see what had their commander so agitated. One by one they caught sight of the fleet, and the reaction was always the same, an initial moment of incomprehension followed by a dawning horror as the scale became apparent. These were professional soldiers, men who had been trained not to panic, but the sight before them bypassed training and struck directly at some deeper level of understanding. They were looking at their own doom, packaged and delivered with industrial efficiency, and there was something almost metaphysically terrifying about it. The younger soldiers looked to Richter and the other veterans for reassurance, for some sign that this was still a situation that could be handled, but what they saw in the faces of their experienced officers only deepened their fear. This was not something that could be handled through superior tactics or fighting spirit. This was mathematics, cold and final, and the equation did not favour the defenders. Richter barked out orders to his gun crews, years of training asserting themselves even as part of his mind remained frozen in shock. The men moved with practiced efficiency, bringing up the heavy shells from their magazines, checking the mechanical systems, preparing the guns for action. The rangefinders began calling out numbers, calculating distances to targets that were still several miles offshore but closing steadily. The massive barrels of the artillery pieces elevated slowly, turning to face the seaward threat, their mechanisms making small mechanical sounds that seemed absurdly quiet compared to the enormity of what they were about to engage. Richter found himself going through the mental calculations automatically, determining firing solutions and selecting priority targets, even though some part of him understood the futility of it all. They had 4 guns operational, excellent weapons by the standards of German artillery, but 4 guns against thousands of ships was not a battle, it was a gesture, a statement that they would not go quietly, even though the outcome was already determined. As the sun continued to rise, burning off the last of the mist and revealing the full panorama of the invasion fleet in sharp detail, Richter could make out individual ships with horrifying clarity. He watched as the landing craft began to organize themselves into waves, forming up in patterns that spoke of meticulous planning and endless rehearsal. The naval vessels were taking up bombardment positions, and he could see their gun turrets training toward the shore with mechanical precision. The whole vast machine was moving with a coordination that was beautiful in a terrible way. Thousands of separate vessels, all working toward a single purpose, with the kind of efficiency that only comes from massive resources and exhaustive preparation. Somewhere far offshore, he knew there were command ships coordinating this ballet of destruction, officers studying maps and timetables, ensuring that every element of the invasion moved according to plan. The thought that struck him most forcefully in those moments before the firing began was not about the immediate tactical situation, but about what this fleet represented in terms of industrial capacity. He found himself thinking not about the ships themselves, but about the factories that had built them, the shipyards that had launched them, the training facilities that had prepared their crews. Every vessel he could see represented thousands of hours of labor, tons of steel, massive organizational effort spread across multiple nations. The United States alone had built this kind of industrial juggernaut, but Britain and Canada and all the other allied nations had contributed their own production to the effort. Germany had built impressive fortifications, had developed technically superior weapons in many categories, but what good was technical superiority when you were outnumbered 50-1? The Tiger tank might be the best tank in the world on a 1-to-1 basis, but when the other side could produce 10 tanks for every one you built, technical superiority became a strategic dead end. He thought about the Luftwaffe, which was supposed to contest the skies and prevent exactly this kind of massive naval operation. Looking up, he saw the sky beginning to fill with aircraft, but they were all Allied planes, fighters providing air cover, bombers moving inland to hit German positions, transport aircraft that had already dropped paratroopers during the night. Where were the Messerschmitts? Where were the Focke-Wulfs that were supposed to drive off enemy bombers and strafe landing craft? The answer was that they did not exist in sufficient numbers, had been ground down by years of combat, and could not be replaced fast enough to matter. On this day, the Luftwaffe would manage perhaps 300 sorties across all of France, while the Allies would fly more than 14,000. The disparity was so enormous that it ceased to be about tactics or pilot skill and became purely about who could put more planes in the air. And the answer to that question had been determined years ago in the factories of America and Britain, in the training schools that produced pilots faster than Germany could shoot them down, in the logistical networks that could keep thousands of aircraft fueled and armed and operational. The order to engage finally came through from headquarters, the authorization to open fire that Richter had been waiting for, even though he knew it would make little difference in the final outcome. He shouted the command to his gun crews, feeling a grim satisfaction at finally being able to take action instead of just watching. The first gun roared, the sound of it so loud and physical that it seemed to punch the air, followed seconds later by the second and third guns joining in. The shells screamed out over the water on ballistic arcs that Richter could track through his binoculars, and he watched as the first salvo landed among the fleet, raising tall plumes of white water where the shells impacted. The gun crews adjusted their aim based on where the shells had fallen, correcting for wind and distance, and fired again. This time Richter saw flashes of impact on actual ships, and his professional pride surged despite everything. His men were good, well-trained and capable, and they were making their shots count. One of the destroyers took what appeared to be a direct hit, and Richter saw the distinctive orange flash of an explosion, followed by black smoke pouring from the vessel. The USS Corrie, though he did not know its name, had been struck and would eventually sink, whether from his shells or from a mine, or from some combination of damage that added up to a fatal wound. His men actually cheered when they saw the ship listing, taking encouragement from the visible evidence that they could hurt the enemy, that we were not completely powerless against this steel armada. For a few minutes, Richter allowed himself to focus purely on the gunnery problem, on directing fire and making each shot count, on being a professional artillery officer doing his job. But even as his guns fired with disciplined rhythm, he could see that it made no meaningful difference to the overall situation. The fleet did not slow down, did not scatter, did not show any sign of being deterred by the loss of a single destroyer. The gap in the formation simply closed up, and the endless lines of ships continued their steady advance toward the beaches. Then came the response from the Allied naval guns, and Richter understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of truly overwhelming firepower. The big ships, battleships and cruisers with guns that could throw shells weighing as much as a small car, began to train their weapons on the German positions. He saw the muzzle flashes first, bright stabs of light from across the water, and had just enough time to brace himself before the world started to come apart. The naval shells were enormous, far larger than anything his own guns fired, and when they began landing around his position, the effect was catastrophic. The ground heaved and bucked like a living thing, great geysers of earth and rock fountaining into the air. The sound was beyond deafening, a physical assault that seemed to compress his chest and make his ears ring even deep inside the concrete bunker. The bombardment was not random or scattered, but methodical and precise, the result of careful observation and fire direction from spotters who could see where their shells were landing and adjust accordingly. One of Richter's gun positions took a direct hit, and he watched helplessly as the emplacement simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater and a cloud of smoke and debris. Another gun was knocked out of action by a near miss that damaged its traversing mechanism, leaving it unable to track targets. The telephone lines that connected him to other positions began to go dead as shells cut the cables, isolating him and forcing him to rely on visual observation and hand signals to coordinate what remained of his battery. The concrete of his observation post shuddered with each nearby impact, dust and chips of stone falling from the ceiling, and he found himself wondering if even these thick walls would be enough to protect them if the naval gunners decided to focus their full attention on this specific bunker. Looking out over the water again, he could see that the landing craft were now approaching the shore, the first waves timing their run to the beach to coincide with the naval bombardment that was supposed to have suppressed or destroyed the German defences. The little boats, each one packed with soldiers who were probably terrified and sick from the rough crossing, ploughed through the surf toward the obstacles that Rommel had ordered placed on the beaches. Richter could see German machine gun positions lower down on the bluffs beginning to open fire, the tracers arcing out toward the landing craft in streams of deadly light. The Americans, because he could now see clearly enough to identify them as Americans from their equipment and uniforms, were running into a hail of fire as the ramps dropped and they tried to wade ashore through the surf. Men were falling, the water around the landing craft turning red, bodies floating in the waves. For a terrible moment, it looked like the defensive plan was working, like the killing zones were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. The beach that would become known as Omaha was turning into a slaughterhouse, with the first waves of American troops pinned down under withering fire from positions that the naval bombardment had failed to completely neutralize. Richter watched men trying to find cover behind the beach obstacles, trying to crawl forward through the sand, trying to do anything except stay in the water where the machine gun fire was methodically cutting them down. The 352nd Division was exacting a terrible price for every yard of sand, and the Americans seemed to be on the verge of stalling completely, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat back into the sea. It was exactly the scenario that German defensive doctrine called for, holding the invaders on the beach where they were most vulnerable, preventing them from establishing a foothold from which they could expand inland. But then the industrial equation reasserted itself in a way that no amount of concrete or barbed wire could stop. The American destroyers, seeing their troops being massacred on the beach, did something that naval doctrine said was insane, but desperation made necessary. They steamed directly toward the shore, some of them closing to within 1,000 yards of the beach, so close that they were scraping their hulls on sandbars and risking running aground. At that point-blank range, They turned their 5-inch guns on the German bunkers and began firing with the kind of accuracy that only came from being able to see your target with the naked eye. The concrete emplacements that had seemed so solid began to crack and crumble under the sustained hammering from naval guns that had been designed to fight other warships. Pillboxes disappeared in explosions of concrete and steel. Machine gun nests were obliterated. The carefully constructed defensive positions were being systematically dismantled by firepower that the German defenders had no way to counter. At the same time, strange vehicles began appearing on the beach, machines that Richter had never seen before and could barely understand. Amphibious trucks drove directly out of the sea as if the distinction between water and land meant nothing to them, carrying supplies and reinforcements that would keep the attack going even as casualties mounted. Tanks came ashore, some of them equipped with bizarre flails that beat the ground ahead of them to detonate mines, others mounting engineer equipment or flamethrowers. These specialised vehicles, what the British called Hobart's Funnies after the officer who had developed them, were designed to solve specific problems that amphibious assaults presented. They could clear mines, destroy obstacles, bridge gaps, and provide close support to infantry in ways that conventional tanks could not. The Germans had nothing comparable, had not devoted the resources to developing this kind of specialised equipment, and the result was that problems which stopped German attacks could be overcome by Allied engineering. The methodical destruction of the beach defences continued throughout the morning, each strongpoint located and neutralised in turn by a combination of naval gunfire, tank rounds, and infantry assault. The defenders of the 352nd Division fought with desperate courage, knowing that if they failed here there would be no second line of defence, but courage alone could not stop shells or deflect bullets. Casualties among the German defenders were horrific, with estimates suggesting around 1,200 men killed, wounded, or captured from the division on that single day, a devastating percentage of the fighting force that had been spread thin along too much coastline. Richter's own battery had been reduced to a single operational gun, the others destroyed or damaged beyond quick repair, and even that one gun was running low on ammunition as the supply lines collapsed under the bombardment. He looked up at the sky again and saw that it had become a solid mass of Allied aircraft, layer upon layer of them at different altitudes, fighters flying cover for bombers heading inland to hit German positions and transportation networks, transport planes still bringing in paratroopers and supplies. The air belonged completely to the Allies, and without air superiority, the German response was crippled before it could even begin. The armoured reserves, the panzer divisions that were supposed to counterattack and drive the invasion back into the sea, were paralysed by a combination of confused orders and the knowledge that moving in daylight would bring down swarms of fighter bombers on their heads. The 21st Panzer Division, the closest armoured unit to the invasion beaches, spent crucial hours waiting for authorization to move, and when it finally did receive orders to attack, it was already too late. The division advanced without air cover into a sky full of Allied planes, and the result was predictable and brutal. Tanks were destroyed from the air before they ever reached the front lines, and what remained of the division was too weak to make any meaningful impact on the battle. It was in watching this systematic destruction of German military capability that Richter experienced a moment of almost transcendent clarity about the nature of the war he was fighting. This was not really a battle in the traditional sense, where two forces of roughly equal capability met and skill and courage determined the outcome. This was an extermination, a process by which overwhelming industrial and material superiority was applied to erase an enemy force that had no realistic chance of success. The Allies were not trying to outmaneuver the Germans or outthink them or defeat them through superior tactics. They were applying resources on a scale that made tactics largely irrelevant, burying the defenders under an avalanche of steel and high explosive that simply could not be stopped by any amount of training or fortification. The realization went deeper than just this particular battle, or even this particular campaign. Richter found himself thinking about the entire war, about the strategic situation that Germany faced, and understanding with horrible clarity that it was already over and had been over for some time. The factories of America were producing tanks, planes, ships, guns, ammunition, and every other necessity of modern war at rates that Germany simply could not match. The numbers were not just unfavourable, they were apocalyptically one-sided. Where Germany might build 2,000 tanks in a month, America was building 10,000. Where the Luftwaffe struggled to replace its losses, the Allies were adding thousands of new aircraft every month. The industrial base that supported the Allied war effort was so vast and so productive that it could absorb losses that would cripple any other nation and simply keep producing more. He thought about all the propaganda he had been exposed to over the years, the speeches about willpower and ideological purity and the decadence of the democracies. It had all been lies, or more precisely, it had all been irrelevant. Willpower did not stop a bomber. Ideological commitment did not sink a battleship. The purity of National Socialist thought could not conjure tanks out of thin air or make German factories produce at rates they were not capable of achieving. The entire edifice of the regime's claims about superiority and inevitable victory collapsed when confronted with the simple mathematical reality of industrial production figures. Germany had started a war against nations with 10 times its production capacity and had somehow convinced itself that this could be overcome through superior fighting spirit. It was madness disguised as confidence, and now the bill was coming due. Standing in his damaged bunker with the world exploding around him, Richter felt something close to despair wash over him. He was a good soldier, his men were good soldiers, they had done everything asked of them and more. But it did not matter. They were pieces in a game that had already been decided, fighting not because there was any hope of victory, but because stopping would mean acknowledging the futility of it all. The officers and men under his command looked to him for leadership, for some sign that their sacrifice meant something. But what could he tell them? That they were dying to delay the inevitable? That every hour they held was bought with blood but changed nothing about the final outcome? The truth was too bitter to speak aloud, so he maintained the fiction of meaningful resistance even as he watched it crumble around him. The psychological weight of this understanding was crushing in a way that physical danger never had been. On the Eastern Front he had faced terrible odds and seen horrible things, but there had always been the sense that the outcome was still in doubt, that the next battle or the next offensive might turn the tide. Here, on the bluffs above Normandy, watching an invasion force that seemed to have no end, he knew with absolute certainty that there would be no turning of the tide. This was the future, this overwhelming of German positions through sheer weight of material, and it would continue until Germany had nothing left to throw into the fight. Some officers in the later stages of the war would choose to end things on their own terms, rather than continue participating in a struggle that had lost all meaning, and in that moment Richter understood why they might make that choice. The naval bombardment reached a new level of intensity as more ships joined in, creating a continuous rolling thunder that never paused or slackened. The concrete of the bunker vibrated with the impacts, and Richter wondered how long even these massive walls would hold up under such punishment. Through his observation slit he could see the beach now swarming with American soldiers who had made it past the initial defensive fire. They were pushing inland, clearing the bluffs, attacking German positions from angles that the defenders had not anticipated. The carefully prepared defensive scheme was coming apart as strong points fell and the interlocking fields of fire were broken up. Without communication to coordinate a response, each position fought its own isolated battle, and isolated positions could be defeated in detail no matter how bravely they fought. More waves of landing craft were hitting the beach now, and Richter could see supply dumps being established, vehicles rolling ashore, all the infrastructure of a major military operation being set up with practiced efficiency. This was not some hastily organized gamble, but a carefully planned operation that had been rehearsed down to the smallest detail. The Allies had spent years preparing for this moment, building the ships and planes and tanks, training the men, working out the logistics, practicing the procedures. Germany had built a wall and hoped it would be enough. The Allies had built an entire industrial system dedicated to breaking that wall, And now that system was running at full capacity with the kind of momentum that could not be stopped by scattered batteries of artillery and isolated infantry companies. As noon approached, Richter's position was nearly untenable. Most of his guns were destroyed, his communications were cut, and the naval bombardment had made it clear that staying in the bunker was just waiting to die when a shell finally scored a direct hit. He gathered his surviving men and made the decision to pull back inland, to try to link up with other units and establish a new defensive line further from the coast. It was an admission of defeat in the battle for the beach, but staying would have been suicide without purpose. As they moved through the ruined landscape behind the coastal defences, he could see other units making the same calculation, small groups of soldiers falling back in as much order as they could maintain while under fire from both the air and the ships offshore. The next 2 months would see continuous fighting as the Allies expanded their beachhead and pushed inland through the Norman hedgerows. It would be brutal, costly combat where every field and every village had to be fought for, where German defensive skills would make the advance slower and bloodier than the Allies had hoped. But the outcome was never in doubt. Every German tank destroyed was one less tank. Every soldier killed or captured was a loss that could not be replaced. The Allies, by contrast, could afford their casualties because the industrial machine behind them never stopped producing more of everything. If they lost a tank, 3 more would arrive to replace it. If an infantry company was destroyed, a fresh company would be shipped over from England. The conveyor belt of men and material ran continuously, fed by the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. For the German soldiers who survived the 6th of June, the rest of the war became a kind of prolonged agony, fighting battles they knew they could not win, dying for objectives that had no strategic value, retreating slowly toward a homeland that was itself being destroyed from the air. Some fought on out of a sense of duty to their comrades, not wanting to let down the men who depended on them. Others fought because they feared what would happen to their families if Germany lost, having been told horror stories about what the victors would do. Still, others simply followed orders because that was what soldiers did, not thinking too deeply about the larger questions of purpose or meaning. Patriotism became disconnected from reality, a reflex rather than a conviction, something to cling to because the alternative was admitting that all the sacrifice had been for nothing. Richter himself would survive the Normandy campaign, wounded twice but managing to avoid capture, eventually ending up in the retreat across France and back toward the German border. He would see the Wehrmacht dissolve from a fighting force into a collection of desperate men trying to delay the inevitable, would watch the final collapse in the spring of 1945, when there was simply nothing left to fight with and nowhere left to retreat to. But for him, as for many other German soldiers, the real end had come on the morning of the 6th of June, when he looked through his binoculars and saw an armada that filled the horizon. That was the moment when he understood that the war was lost, that Germany had committed itself to a struggle it could not possibly win, that all the suffering and dying that would follow was just the slow working out of an equation that had already been solved. The story of D-Day is usually told from the Allied perspective, focusing on the courage of the men who stormed the beaches and the brilliance of the planning that made the operation possible. Those stories are important and deserve to be told, celebrating a genuine triumph of democracy over tyranny and the liberation of occupied Europe from a murderous regime. But there is also value in understanding what the invasion looked like from the other side, through the eyes of professional soldiers like Richter, who found themselves on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of an industrial imbalance that doomed their cause from the start. They were not all fanatics or war criminals. Many were just men doing what they thought was their duty, and their experience of that day was one of overwhelming shock and dawning horror as they realized what they were facing. The massive Allied fleet that appeared off Normandy that morning represented more than just military force. It was a statement about the nature of modern industrial warfare, about what happens when the full productive capacity of major economies is turned toward the purpose of war. Germany had built excellent weapons and trained skilled soldiers, but it had started a conflict with nations that could outproduce it by factors of 10 or 20 to 1. That disparity was survivable in the short term through superior tactics and the advantage of prepared positions, but in any extended conflict, the side with greater resources would grind down the side with fewer resources until nothing remained. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, was just a speed bump in the path of an industrial juggernaut that had the capacity to simply overwhelm any fixed defences through sustained application of firepower. The moment when Richter saw the fleet was the moment when abstract strategic calculations became physical reality. He was not looking at ships, he was looking at the output of thousands of factories, the product of millions of workers, the result of an economic system that had been mobilized for war on a scale that beggared the imagination. Every ship represented thousands of tons of steel that had been mined, refined, shaped, and assembled. Every plane overhead represented aluminum and engines and instruments that had been manufactured to precise specifications. Every shell that fell around his position represented explosives and metal that had been produced in quantities sufficient to fire thousands of rounds per gun per day. The logistics of supporting an invasion of this scale were mind-boggling, requiring coordination of shipping and supplies across an ocean, but the Allies had the organizational capacity to make it work. Germany, by contrast, was already running on fumes by mid-1944, its factories struggling to maintain production in the face of Allied bombing, its transportation network crumbling, its access to raw materials increasingly constrained. The synthetic fuel plants were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt, meaning that even the tanks and planes Germany could still produce often sat idle for lack of fuel. The industrial base was being systematically dismantled from the air while simultaneously being outproduced by enemies who faced no such constraints. It was a race that Germany had lost before it even began, and the invasion fleet sitting off Normandy was proof of just how badly they had lost. In the decades since the war, historians have analysed D-Day from every possible angle, studying the planning, the execution, the tactical decisions, the human drama. The invasion has been portrayed in countless books and films, usually focusing on the heroism and sacrifice of the Allied soldiers. These portrayals are accurate and important, but they sometimes miss the broader context of industrial might that made the whole operation possible. The bravery of individual soldiers mattered enormously at the tactical level, but the strategic outcome was determined by factors far removed from the beaches, by decisions made in factories and shipyards and training centres years before the first landing craft touched French sand. Wars between industrial powers are won by economic capacity more than military skill, and World War II was the ultimate proof of that principle. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, standing in his observation post as the world he knew came to an end, the lesson was simple and brutal. He had been sent to fight in a war that had already been lost, armed with weapons that were too few to matter, backed by an economy that could not sustain the conflict, serving a regime that had committed the fundamental strategic error of challenging enemies it could never outproduce. His professional skill as an artilleryman was irrelevant when the other side could afford to simply saturate his position with more shells than he could possibly answer. His courage and that of his men was meaningless when they were outnumbered 10 to 1 and had no hope of reinforcement or relief. He was a good soldier in a bad cause, and the industrial might of the Allied nations was about to erase him and everything he fought for with the impersonal efficiency of a factory stamping out parts. The sun continued to rise over the English Channel that morning, burning off the last of the mist and revealing the full scope of the Allied invasion in pitiless detail. The fleet that had seemed impossible in the pre-dawn darkness was even more overwhelming in full daylight, a solid wall of steel that reached from one end of the visible horizon to the other. Landing craft continued to stream toward the beaches in waves that never seemed to end, each one carrying more men and material into the fight. The naval guns continued their methodical destruction of German positions, working through target lists that had been prepared long in advance. Allied aircraft owned the skies completely, unopposed and unchallenged, free to attack any German unit that tried to move toward the battle. It was a display of coordinated military power that represented the pinnacle of industrial warfare, the ultimate expression of what could be achieved when massive resources were organized toward a single purpose. And standing amid the ruins of his battery, watching the empire he had served dissolve before his eyes, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter understood that he was witnessing not just the invasion of France, but the death of Germany's hopes for victory. The Third Reich would continue to fight for almost another year, would drag millions more down into the grave with it, but the outcome had been determined on that beach in Normandy. The industrial democracies had proven that they could outproduce, outfight, and outlast the supposed master race, and they had done it with such overwhelming superiority that the result had never been in serious doubt. The Atlantic Wall had not failed because it was poorly built or poorly defended. It had failed because it was a concrete barrier trying to stop a steel tsunami, and no amount of concrete could change the fundamental mathematics of industrial capacity. This is what defeat looks like when it comes not as a single catastrophic battle, but as a slow realization that you are on the wrong side of an equation that has only one possible solution. This is what happens when ideology runs headlong into industrial reality and discovers that belief cannot manufacture tanks or courage conjure aircraft. This is the story of one German officer who saw the future arriving on his doorstep in the form of the largest invasion fleet ever assembled, and who understood in that moment that everything he had fought for was already lost, that the war would continue, but the outcome was certain, that he and his men were not combatants in a fair fight, but obstacles to be cleared by machines that ran with merciless efficiency. The morning of June 6, 1944, was when the certainty of German defeat became visible in physical form, when the abstract strategic situation materialized as thousands of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, when the industrial might of the Allies stopped being a theoretical consideration and became an immediate existential threat that could not be denied or rationalized away.